The courthouse bell tolled 5 times across the dusty streets of Copper Creek, Arizona Territory, each clang echoing like a death knell in the desert heat. But it wasn't marking the hour, it was counting daughters. 5 sisters would stand on those weathered courthouse steps today, their fathers' gambling debts carved into their futures like brands on cattle. The crowd gathered with the hungry anticipation of vultures, men clutching bills and women averting their eyes, all pretending this was civilization instead of savagery, dressed in Sunday clothes. Sarah Hayes smoothed her youngest sister's auburn hair one last time, whispering promises neither believed. Rebecca's green eyes blazed with defiance even as her small hands trembled. She'd heard the stories about auction day, about girls who went up those steps and never came home. From the shadows of the general store, a lone figure in black watched, her gloved hand unconsciously touching a hidden scar on her wrist. Only one sister would escape those steps today, but none of them knew which miracle was about to unfold. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The morning sun had barely crested the mesa when the Hayes sisters began their final preparations in the cramped cabin that had been their sanctuary for 16 years. Sarah, at 22, moved through the motions of braiding her sister's hair with the practiced grace of a woman who had raised children while still a child herself. Her secret weighed heavy in her chest, the life growing within her that no buyer must discover. Emma sat perfectly still as Sarah's fingers worked, her artist's hands clutching a small sketch of their mother's face, the only portrait that remained after their father had sold everything else. At 20, she possessed the gentle beauty that attracted men like moths to flame, but her eyes held depths that spoke of dreams larger than any man's parlor. Catherine paced the small room like a caged wildcat, her 18-year-old spirit refusing to accept what this day would bring. "We could run," she whispered fiercely, not for the first time. Take the horses and ride for California, but they all knew the desert would claim them faster than any husband ever could. Grace knelt in the corner, her 16-year-old lips moving in silent prayer, her fingers working the worn beads of their mother's rosary. She found comfort in surrender where Catherine found only rage, believing with the faith of youth that God's plan, however mysterious, would protect them. Rebecca, the baby at 14, sat cross-legged on the floor, committing every detail to memory. The way Sarah hummed their mother's lullaby, the morning light streaming through the cracked window, the smell of Emma's lavender soap. Someone needed to remember what the Hayes family had been before they were scattered to the winds. Thomas Hayes stood in the doorway, his Union Army uniform pressed despite his trembling hands. The war had taken his peace, gambling had taken his money, and today would take his daughters. "The Lord tests us as he tested Abraham," he said, his voice cracking with conviction and whiskey. "Sometimes we must sacrifice our most precious treasures to prove our faith." "Abraham got his son back," Catherine snapped, her green eyes flashing. "Will we get that same miracle, Papa?" Thomas turned away, unable to meet her gaze. The advance payments hidden beneath his mattress burned in his conscience like hot coals, but he'd convinced himself this was salvation, not destruction. These men would provide for his daughters better than he ever could. They would have roofs over their heads, food in their bellies, purpose in their days. Outside, the town of Copper Creek stirred to life with an energy that felt wrong for such a morning. Margaret Whitmore adjusted her black mourning dress as she watched the Hayes cabin from across the dusty street. Her gloved fingers traced the silver bracelet that hid scars no lady should bear, and her jaw set with determination that had been 12 years in the making. Today, she would right an ancient wrong. Today, she would save the daughters she couldn't save before. The courthouse bell began its first warning toll, and 5 sisters held each other one last time before walking toward their fates. The courthouse steps had never felt so much like a scaffold. By 8 in the morning, half of Copper Creek had gathered in the dusty square, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and uncomfortable shame. The men clutched their bills with sweaty palms while their wives whispered behind gloved hands, all of them complicit in this theater of human commerce disguised as legal proceedings. Judge Samuel Morrison adjusted his spectacles as he reviewed the papers that would transform 5 daughters into property. A portly man with silver whiskers and a voice that carried the authority of territorial law, he had presided over dozens of such debt settlements in his 15 years on the bench. To him, these girls represented order restored, obligations met, and the proper functioning of civilized society in the wilderness. The Hayes sisters emerged from their cabin like condemned prisoners walking to execution. Sarah held Rebecca's hand so tightly their knuckles went white, while Emma clutched her small leather portfolio of sketches, the only possessions she would be allowed to keep. Catherine's jaw was set in defiant stone, and Grace's lips moved in constant, silent prayer. Thomas Hayes followed behind them, his military bearing unable to mask the tremor in his step. He had rehearsed his speech about God's will and necessary sacrifices, but the words felt like ash in his mouth as he watched his daughters climb those wooden steps. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Morrison's voice boomed across the square, "we gather today to resolve the outstanding debts of Mr. Thomas Hayes, veteran of our great Union Army, who has fallen upon difficult circumstances through no fault of his own." Margaret Whitmore positioned herself near the hitching post where her black stallion waited, her widow's weeds making her nearly invisible in the morning shadows. Her heart hammered against her ribs as memories flooded back, the taste of fear, the rough wood beneath her own bare feet, the sound of men's voices reducing her to livestock. But this time would be different. This time she had power. The bidding began with Sarah, and Margaret watched in barely controlled fury as the men appraised the eldest sister like horseflesh. Jacob Miller, a rancher from the next valley, opened with $40, his weathered face kind, but his eyes calculating. He seemed decent enough, but Margaret had learned long ago that decent men didn't buy women at auction. $50, called Wesley Brooks, the town's merchant, his thin lips twisted in what might have been a smile. Margaret had heard whispers about Brooks, about his previous wives, who had vanished into the desert after bearing his children. The bidding escalated quickly. Sarah stood with her chin raised, her maternal instincts making her appear older than her 22 years. When the hammer finally fell at $85 to Jacob Miller, she whispered something to her sisters that made Rebecca sob. Emma was next, and Margaret's hands clenched into fists as the same grotesque theater repeated. The girl's artistic soul seemed to shrink with each callous appraisal, each crude comment about her breeding potential. Wesley Brooks secured her for $70, his victory smile making Margaret's stomach turn. Catherine fought. When Frank Turner, the saloon owner with hands like ham hocks and breath that reeked of whiskey, won her for $95, she had to be physically restrained. "I'll die first," she screamed, her voice carrying across the desert like a war cry. "I'll die before I let you touch me." Turner laughed, a sound like grinding gravel. "They all say that, darling. But they learn." Grace accepted her fate with the resignation of a martyr, allowing herself to be sold to elderly Henry Cooper for $60. The farmer's first wife had died under mysterious circumstances, but Grace seemed to find peace in the belief that God would protect her. Finally, only Rebecca remained. At 14, she was the youngest, but perhaps the strongest, her green eyes blazing with intelligence and fury. The bidding started at $40, with Ezra Blackstone, a cruel cattle baron known for his treatment of both animals and people, leading the charge. $60, Blackstone growled, his scarred face twisted in anticipation. 70, countered Dr. Harrison, the town physician whose medical practice included services no respectable doctor should provide. Margaret watched Rebecca stand alone on those cursed steps, remembering another girl who had stood there 12 years ago, a girl named Mary Rose Patterson, who had believed in justice and mercy until both abandoned her to the highest bidder. Her hand moved to the hidden derringer in her reticule as Blackstone's bid reached $120. The crowd held its breath. Rebecca Hayes, the last daughter, stood defiant against the desert sky, and somewhere in the shadows Margaret Whitmore prepared to change the course of history with words that would shatter the morning silence like thunder. The bidding for Rebecca had reached a fever pitch that made the morning air crackle with tension. Ezra Blackstone's voice boomed across the courthouse square as he raised his offer to $130, his cold eyes never leaving the 14-year-old girl who stood defiant despite her trembling hands. Dr. Harrison countered with $135, his medical bag clutched tightly as if it contained salvation rather than instruments of a darker trade. Rebecca's green eyes swept the crowd, searching for any face that might offer mercy, but found only the hungry stares of men who saw her as commodity and the averted gazes of women who couldn't bear to witness what their silence had enabled. Her father stood rigid beside Judge Morrison, his military posture betraying none of the anguish that twisted his features. "Do I hear 140? Judge Morrison called, his gavel poised like an executioner's axe above the wooden block. The crowd leaned forward in anticipation, sensing that the final act of this human tragedy was about to unfold. That's when the voice cut through the desert air like a blade through silk. $200. The words fell into the stunned silence with the weight of thunder, and every head turned toward the figure emerging from the shadows near the hitching post. Margaret Whitmore stepped into the harsh sunlight, her black mourning dress a stark contrast to the dusty browns and faded blues of the gathered crowd. In her gloved hand, she held a leather purse that clinked with the promise of gold. Ezra Blackstone's face darkened like a storm cloud. "Now see here, woman. This ain't no place for your kind of interference." Margaret's voice carried the authority of someone who had learned to command respect in a world that offered women precious little of it. "This is a legal proceeding, Mr. Blackstone, and my money spends as well as yours." She stepped closer to the courthouse steps, and Rebecca caught her breath at the intensity in the widow's dark eyes. $200, Judge Morrison. Gold, not promises. The judge's spectacles nearly slipped from his nose. "Mrs. Whitmore, while we appreciate your civic interest, this is highly irregular. The girl would become your property, subject to your complete authority." "No!" Margaret's interruption silenced the murmuring crowd like a gunshot. "I'm not buying her, Judge Morrison. I'm adopting her." The word hung in the air like morning mist, foreign and impossible. Adoption? Such things happened in the East, perhaps, among people of breeding and education, but here in the Arizona Territory, children were born, sold, or abandoned. They weren't chosen. Thomas Hayes found his voice first, confusion replacing the resignation that had carried him through the morning. "Adopt? What do you mean, adopt?" "She's my daughter, not some orphan foundling." Margaret turned her penetrating gaze on him, and Thomas felt something cold crawl up his spine. "Mr. Hayes, you've just spent the morning selling your daughters to pay gambling debts. By your own actions, you've declared yourself unfit to be their father. I'm offering Rebecca my name, my protection, and my home, not as property, but as family." Dr. Harrison stepped forward, his medical authority lending weight to his words. "This is preposterous. There's no legal precedent for such an arrangement. The girl is being sold to settle legitimate debts." "Legitimate?" Margaret's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "What's legitimate about selling children like cattle? What's legitimate about men bidding on a 14-year-old girl's future? She reached into her purse and withdrew a heavy leather pouch, letting it fall to the courthouse steps where it landed with a satisfying thud. "There's your gold, Judge Morrison. $200 in territorial tender. But I'm not paying for ownership, I'm paying for her freedom." Rebecca stared at this mysterious woman who had materialized like an answer to prayers she'd been afraid to voice. Something in Margaret's eyes spoke of understanding, of shared pain, of secrets that only survivors could recognize. For the first time since stepping onto these cursed courthouse steps, Rebecca dared to hope. Judge Morrison picked up the leather pouch, feeling its weight, then looked uncertainly between Margaret and the assembled crowd. Ezra Blackstone's face had turned purple with rage, while Dr. Harrison clutched his medical bag like a shield. The entire square held its breath, waiting for someone to speak the words that would determine Rebecca Hayes's fate. In that moment of crystalline silence, Margaret Whitmore smiled at Rebecca with the fierce protectiveness of a mother bear and whispered words that would echo across the desert for years to come. "Choose, Rebecca. Choose your own future." The legal battle that erupted on the courthouse steps drew spectators from 3 counties, transforming what should have been a simple debt settlement into a territorial crisis. Judge Morrison found himself caught between the ironclad traditions of property law and the unprecedented challenge that Margaret Whitmore had thrown at his feet like a gauntlet. He retreated to his chambers with territorial law books under one arm and a bottle of whiskey under the other, declaring that proceedings would resume the following morning. That evening, Rebecca found herself in a world she had never imagined existed. Margaret's ranch sprawled across a verdant valley 15 miles outside Copper Creek, where cottonwoods lined a year-round stream, and the house itself seemed to breathe with welcome. It was built from local stone and timber, with wide porches that caught the evening breeze, and windows that opened onto views of endless sky. "Welcome home, child," Margaret said as she helped Rebecca down from the buggy, and something in those simple words made Rebecca's throat tighten with emotion she couldn't name. Inside the house, Rebecca met Rose, a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with kind eyes and capable hands, who managed the household with quiet efficiency. Rose served them dinner, real beef and fresh vegetables, not the thin gruel that had sustained the Hayes family through their final months, and Rebecca ate until her stomach ached with unaccustomed fullness. "Rose has been with me for 2 years," Margaret explained as they sat by the fireplace afterward. "She came to me under circumstances not unlike your own." Rose looked up from her mending, and Rebecca saw something familiar in her expression, the careful wariness of someone who had learned not to trust too quickly or completely. "Mrs. Whitmore saved my life," Rose said simply. "Just like she's saving yours." As the evening wore on, Rebecca discovered that Margaret's ranch was home to 6 other women, each with her own story of rescue and recovery. There was Martha, a widow whose husband's creditors had tried to claim her along with his debts. Elena, barely 18, who had fled an arranged marriage to a man 3 times her age. Catherine, not her sister Catherine, but another young woman who had escaped from a brothel in Tucson. Each woman had found sanctuary here, and each contributed to the ranch's operation according to her abilities and inclinations. "You're not the first, Rebecca," Margaret said quietly, as she showed the girl to a bedroom that was larger and more comfortable than any space Rebecca had ever called her own. "And you won't be the last, Lord willing." That night, Rebecca lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with questions and possibilities. Through the open window, she could hear the gentle lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, sounds of peace that seemed impossible after the morning's trauma. Meanwhile, in Copper Creek, Rebecca's sisters were discovering the harsh realities of their new circumstances. Sarah found herself in Jacob Miller's modest ranch house, where the man who had bought her revealed himself to be kinder than she had dared hope, but more complex than she had expected. He prepared her a simple meal and showed her to a small but clean bedroom, making no demands beyond the promise that they would marry within the week. "I know this ain't how you pictured starting a family," he said awkwardly, his weathered hands working the brim of his hat. "But I'll try to be a good husband to you, Sarah. I'll try to make you happy." Sarah touched her still, flat stomach and wondered if happiness was even possible anymore, or if she would spend the rest of her life grateful for kindness that felt like mercy. Emma's situation proved more troubling. Wesley Brooks had locked her in a small room above his general store, informing her through the door that she would remain there until she learned to be grateful for his generosity. The room contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a collection of paintings and sketches that Emma realized with growing horror had belonged to Brooks's previous wives, women whose artistic talents had been preserved long after the women themselves had disappeared. Catherine's fate was the most immediately dangerous. Frank Turner had thrown her into the storage room behind his saloon, where she huddled among crates of whiskey and listened to the raucous laughter from the main room. Turner had made his intentions clear. She would work in his establishment, entertaining his customers in whatever manner they required, and any resistance would be met with violence. Grace found herself in perhaps the strangest situation of all. Henry Cooper's farm was isolated and eerily quiet, dominated by the presence of a small cemetery where his first wife lay buried beneath an elaborate headstone. Cooper spoke to the grave as if his dead wife could hear him, introducing Grace as the new helper and promising that she would be better trained than her predecessor. Back at Margaret's ranch, Rebecca woke before dawn to find her hostess already up, standing on the front porch with a cup of coffee and watching the sun paint the eastern mountains gold. Margaret's face, softened by the morning light, looked younger than her 26 years, but her eyes held depths that spoke of experiences no young woman should have endured. "Tell me about my sisters," Rebecca said, settling beside her on the porch steps. "Are they safe?" Margaret's expression darkened. "I have people watching over them, but I won't lie to you, child. Yesterday was just the beginning of their trials." She sipped her coffee, considering her words carefully. "Your sister Catherine is in immediate danger. Turner's reputation with women is, well, it's why decent folks don't frequent his establishment." Rebecca felt her chest tighten with fear and fury. "We have to help her. We have to help all of them." "And we will," Margaret promised. "But we have to be smart about it. The law isn't on our side, Rebecca. What happened yesterday was legal according to territorial statutes. If we're going to free your sisters, we'll have to find another way." As if summoned by their conversation, a rider appeared on the horizon, approaching the ranch at a gallop. Margaret stood, her hand instinctively moving to the gun belt she wore beneath her widow's dress, a habit Rebecca was beginning to realize spoke of hard-won survival skills. The rider proved to be Tom Bradley, Copper Creek's sheriff, a decent man caught between his duty to enforce unjust laws and his conscience. He dismounted heavily, his face grim with news that made Rebecca's blood run cold. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, touching his hat respectfully, "I'm afraid I've got bad news. There's been trouble in town." Margaret's voice was steady, but Rebecca could see her knuckles whiten as she gripped her coffee cup. "What kind of trouble, Sheriff?" "Your sister Catherine tried to escape from Turner's place last night," Bradley said, addressing Rebecca directly. "She got as far as the main street before his men caught her. Turner's claiming she damaged his property in the attempt, and he's demanding compensation on top of what he already paid." Rebecca's world tilted sideways. "Is she hurt?" The sheriff's silence was answer enough. "How badly?" Margaret's voice cut like a blade. "Doc Harrison's with her now," Bradley said reluctantly. "She's alive, but, well, Turner wanted to make an example, make sure none of the other girls got similar ideas. Rebecca's legs gave out, and she sank back onto the porch steps as rage and helplessness warred in her chest. Margaret's hand settled on her shoulder, warm and solid and somehow reassuring despite the terrible news. "There's more," Sheriff Bradley continued. "Judge Morrison's been getting pressure from the territorial governor's office. Seems word of yesterday's proceedings has reached Santa Fe, and there are folks there who aren't happy about the precedent you're trying to set, Mrs. Whitmore. They're saying that if women can adopt girls out from under legal debt settlements, it could undermine the entire territorial economic system." Margaret laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "God forbid we should undermine a system built on selling children." "I'm just telling you what I heard," Bradley said defensively. "Morrison's scheduled a final hearing for tomorrow morning. Federal territorial law versus local precedent. Winner takes all." As the sheriff rode away, Rebecca looked up at Margaret with desperate eyes. "What if we lose? What if the judge rules against us?" Margaret stared out at the mountains, her jaw set with determination that reminded Rebecca of her sister Catherine's defiant spirit. "Then we'll find another way, child. There's always another way for people brave enough to take it." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret's mind was already turning to darker possibilities, to the loaded guns in her bedroom dresser, to the network of women across 3 territories who had learned to protect themselves when the law wouldn't, to the promise she had made over a grave 12 years ago that no girl would suffer as she had suffered if she possessed the power to prevent it. Tomorrow would bring legal resolution or legal defeat, but either way, Margaret Whitmore was prepared to ensure that Rebecca Hayes and her sisters would never again stand on courthouse steps waiting to be sold to the highest bidder, even if it cost her everything she had built in her carefully constructed new life. The federal hearing convened at 10 o'clock sharp on a morning that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Judge Morrison had transformed his usual courthouse into something resembling a territorial court of appeals, complete with flags and formal procedures that lent gravity to proceedings that would determine not just Rebecca's fate, but the future of women's rights across the Arizona Territory. Federal Marshal Jake Coleman had arrived from Tucson with a reputation for fairness and a briefcase full of territorial statutes that would serve as the final arbiter of justice. A tall man with graying temples and eyes that missed nothing, Coleman surveyed the packed courthouse with the measured gaze of someone who had seen enough human nature to be surprised by very little of it. Margaret entered the courthouse flanked by 2 lawyers she had summoned from Phoenix, expensive men in Eastern suits who commanded respect even in this frontier setting. Rebecca walked beside her, dressed in a simple blue dress that Margaret had provided, her chin raised with dignity that belied her 14 years. The opposition presented an equally formidable front. Thomas Hayes sat with his own legal counsel, though Rebecca could see the guilt written in every line of his posture. Behind him, Ezra Blackstone glowered with the barely contained fury of a man who had been denied something he considered rightfully his. "Doctor." Harrison fidgeted with his medical bag, his nervous energy suggesting secrets he desperately hoped would remain buried. "This hearing will determine the legal standing of adoption procedures in cases of debt settlement," Marshal Coleman announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. "We are here to establish territorial precedent that will govern similar cases throughout Arizona." Margaret's lead attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Benjamin Cross, rose to present their case with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. "Your Honor, we contend that territorial law clearly supports the principle of adoption over sale, particularly when the welfare of a minor child is at stake. Miss Rebecca Hayes is not property to be transferred but a human being entitled to protection under federal statutes governing the treatment of minors." The legal arguments that followed were complex, drawing on precedents from California statehood proceedings and federal territories legislation that most of the audience couldn't follow. But Rebecca understood the essential truth being debated, whether she was a person with rights or an object to be owned. Then Thomas Hayes took the stand, and the courthouse fell into hushed silence. "I want to say something," Thomas began, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands shook as he gripped the witness rail, and Rebecca saw her father as if for the first time. Not the stern patriarch who had raised them with military discipline, but a broken man whose demons had finally caught up with him. "I served 3 years in the Union Army," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "I fought at Gettysburg, at Antietam, at places where good men died for the principle that no human being should be owned by another. And then I came home and I—" The words caught in his throat like broken glass. Rebecca found herself leaning forward, her heart hammering with a mixture of anger and unwanted compassion for the man who had betrayed them all. "I didn't gamble that money away," Thomas said finally, the confession falling into the silence like a stone into still water. "I never lost a single dollar at cards or dice or any other game of chance." The courthouse erupted in whispers and gasps, but Marshal Coleman's gavel quickly restored order. "Continue, Mr. Hayes." Thomas's eyes found Rebecca's across the crowded room, and she saw tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I was paid $500 in advance by those men. $500 to provide them with my daughters, with papers that would make their purchases legal under territorial law." The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Even Judge Morrison, who had presided over dozens of these debt settlements, sat back in his chair with visible shock. This wasn't a desperate father forced to tragic extremes. This was premeditated human trafficking disguised as legal proceedings. "Why?" Rebecca's voice cut through the stunned silence, raw with betrayal and disbelief. "Why would you sell us? We're your daughters." Thomas's face crumpled with anguish. "Because your mother found out about the others, about the network of men who buy young women across 3 territories. She was going to expose them, going to bring federal marshals to investigate. They told me she had to be silenced, and when I refused—" He buried his face in his hands. "They killed her, Rebecca. They made it look like fever, but they poisoned her to keep her quiet. And then they told me I could join her in the ground or I could provide them with what they wanted." Rebecca's world tilted on its axis. Her mother hadn't died of disease. She had been murdered for trying to protect girls just like her own daughters. The grief and rage that crashed over her was so intense that Margaret had to steady her to keep her from falling. "So I took their money," Thomas continued, his voice hollow with self-loathing. "I told myself I was saving your lives, that these men would at least keep you alive where defying them would have gotten us all killed. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd find a way to get you back somehow. I told myself anything that would let me sleep at night." Marshal Coleman leaned forward, his expression grave. "Mr. Hayes, you're describing a criminal conspiracy that extends far beyond this courtroom. Are you prepared to provide names, locations, evidence of this network?" "Everything," Thomas said, straightening his shoulders with something resembling his old military bearing. "Every name, every location, every transaction I know about. They destroyed my family, Marshal. They destroyed my soul. But maybe if I tell the truth now, I can save other families from the same fate." Dr. Harrison suddenly bolted from his seat, making a desperate dash for the courthouse door, but 2 of Marshal Coleman's deputies were waiting. His medical bag spilled open as they tackled him, revealing not just surgical instruments but detailed records of the women he had examined and certified for sale. Dozens of names, ages, and physical descriptions that painted a horrifying picture of systematic human trafficking. "It seems we have our evidence," Marshal Coleman said grimly, as Dr. Harrison was dragged back to his seat in shackles. "This hearing is now a federal investigation into human trafficking across territorial boundaries. Ezra Blackstone tried to make his own escape but found his path blocked by angry townspeople who had finally realized the true nature of what they had witnessed and enabled. The crowd that had gathered to watch a simple legal proceeding now found itself witness to the exposure of a criminal enterprise that had operated under their noses for years. Margaret stood slowly, her hand finding Rebecca's and squeezing tightly. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chaos, "I have something to add to this testimony." Marshal Coleman nodded for her to continue, though Rebecca could see the anticipation in his eyes. He sensed there was more to Margaret Whitmore than met the eye. 12 years ago, Margaret began, I stood on these same courthouse steps. My name then was Mary Rose Patterson, and I was 15 years old when my father sold me to pay debts that I now realize were as fabricated as Mr. Hayes's gambling losses. The revelation sent another shockwave through the courthouse. Rebecca stared at Margaret with new understanding, finally comprehending the source of the fierce protectiveness and deep knowledge of suffering that had drawn her to this fight. "The man who bought me was William Whitmore, and for 3 years he taught me what it meant to be owned by someone who considered you less than human. When he died, and yes, I had a hand in his death, I inherited his ranch and his name. I've spent the last 9 years using his wealth to help women escape the same fate he condemned me to." Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued. "This ranch that you all know as a respectable widow's homestead is actually a sanctuary for women fleeing exactly this kind of trafficking. Rose, who you met yesterday, is my younger sister. We were separated when I was sold, and she's been searching for me ever since. The other women living there are all survivors of similar circumstances." Marshal Coleman was taking detailed notes, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "Mrs. Whitmore, how extensive is your knowledge of this network?" "I have names, locations, and financial records dating back 8 years, Margaret replied. "I've been documenting everything, waiting for the right moment to act. Yesterday, when I saw Rebecca standing where I once stood, I knew that moment had come. The federal hearing that was supposed to determine one girl's adoption had become the catalyst for exposing a criminal enterprise that had destroyed countless families across the territory. But even as justice began to unfold around them, Rebecca knew that her sisters were still in immediate danger from men who now had nothing to lose. The real battle was just beginning. The news that shattered Rebecca's world came with the setting sun, delivered by a ranch hand who had ridden his horse nearly to death to bring word from town. Sarah had gone into premature labor at Jacob Miller's ranch, her body unable to withstand the trauma of being separated from her sisters and the terror of her uncertain future. But Miller, claiming ownership rights over both Sarah and her unborn child, had refused to allow anyone to summon help. "She's been laboring since dawn," the breathless messenger reported to Margaret and Rebecca as they stood on the ranch porch. "Miller says it's his business and his alone. Won't let the doc near her, won't let her sisters come, won't let nobody help at all." Rebecca's knees buckled, and Margaret caught her before she could fall. The image of Sarah suffering alone, calling out for the sisters who had always been her comfort, was more than Rebecca could bear. "We have to go to her," Rebecca gasped through tears that felt like they would never stop. "She's all alone, and she's just a baby herself." Margaret's face had gone pale as weathered bone. She understood better than anyone what it meant for a woman to face childbirth in the hands of a man who viewed her as property rather than a human being. Her own 2 miscarriages during her years with William Whitmore had been times of unspeakable terror and pain, made worse by his indifference to her suffering. "Saddle the horses," Margaret ordered Rose, her voice steady despite the fury burning in her eyes. "All of them. If Miller wants to play by ownership rules, he's about to learn that some things can't be owned." But their desperate ride to Miller's ranch revealed a situation far worse than they had imagined. Jacob Miller stood on his porch with a shotgun across his arms, flanked by 2 hired hands who made it clear that no one would be allowed near his property. Sarah's screams echoed from inside the house, growing weaker with each passing hour, while Miller maintained his legal right to handle his property as he saw fit. "That girl and her baby belong to me now," Miller shouted across the yard when he saw Margaret approaching with Rebecca and Rose. "Paid good money for her, and I'll be damned if I let anyone interfere with my rights as her husband." "You're not her husband yet," Margaret replied, her hand resting on the gun at her hip. "The ceremony hasn't taken place, which means she's still a free woman in the eyes of federal law." Miller's laugh was ugly and sharp. "Federal law don't mean much out here, widow woman. And after today's testimony, folks know you ain't exactly what you pretended to be. Why should anyone listen to a murderer and a whore?" The words hit Margaret like physical blows, but she stood her ground, even as Rebecca gasped beside her. The truth about her past had made her vulnerable in ways she hadn't fully considered, and men like Miller would use that vulnerability to justify any cruelty. Sarah's screams suddenly stopped, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. Rebecca broke from Margaret's side and ran toward the house, but Miller's hired hands blocked her path with drawn guns. "Sarah!" Rebecca cried out, her voice breaking with desperation. "Sarah, I'm here. We're here." From inside the house came a sound that made everyone freeze, the thin, wavering cry of a newborn baby. Sarah had delivered her child, but whether mother or baby would survive remained a terrifying question that hung in the desert air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Meanwhile, 20 miles away, Emma had discovered the full extent of her own nightmare. Wesley Brooks had been drinking since the morning's revelations in court, and his rage at losing his investment had turned violent and unpredictable. He had shown Emma the collection of paintings and sketches left behind by his previous wives, explaining in graphic detail what had happened to each artist when she had outlived her usefulness. "You see, my dear," Brooks slurred as he waved a bottle of whiskey at the artwork covering the walls, "I collect beautiful things. I keep them for as long as they please me, and when they stop pleasing me, well, a man has to protect his investments." Emma pressed herself against the far wall of the small room, her artist's eye taking in details she wished she couldn't see. The way some paintings ended mid-brushstroke, the sketches that showed increasing desperation in their subjects, the dates that revealed how briefly each woman had survived in Brooks's care. Catherine's situation had grown equally desperate. Frank Turner's saloon had become a fortress of sorts, with armed men guarding every entrance, and Catherine locked in the basement storage room, where her screams couldn't be heard by passing townspeople. Turner had made it clear that she would either submit to working in his establishment or she would disappear like so many other troublesome women had disappeared over the years. "The federal marshals can investigate all they want," Turner had told his men earlier that day. "But they can't investigate what they can't find. This girl knows too much now, and she's caused too much trouble. Better to cut our losses and start fresh somewhere else." Grace faced perhaps the strangest danger of all. Henry Cooper's grief over his first wife's death had twisted into something dark and possessive, and he had begun speaking to Grace as if she were the deceased woman returned to life. He had dressed her in his dead wife's clothes, forced her to sit at the gravesite for hours while he spoke to both the living girl and the corpse as if they were the same person. "Elizabeth always understood her place," Cooper muttered as Grace sat frozen with terror beside the weathered headstone. She knew that a wife's duty was to obey, to serve, to never question her husband's wisdom. You'll learn the same lessons she learned, one way or another. As night fell across the Arizona territory, 4 sisters faced mortal danger, while the 5th stood helpless in a ranch yard, listening to the echoes of a newborn's cry, and knowing that everything they had hoped to gain from the morning's legal victory was slipping away like water through their fingers. Margaret stared at Miller's ranch house, calculating odds and distances, knowing that federal law and territorial precedent meant nothing in the face of men willing to kill rather than release their human property. The battle for justice had been won in the courthouse, but the war for survival was about to begin in earnest, and Margaret feared that not all of the Hayes sisters would live to see another sunrise. The revelation that shattered everything Rebecca thought she knew about her protector came in the form of a single photograph that Rose discovered hidden beneath Margaret's mattress while searching for medical supplies to help Sarah. The daguerreotype showed two young girls standing beside a covered wagon, their faces bearing an unmistakable resemblance despite the years that had changed them. Written on the back in faded ink were the words, "Mary Rose and Little Rosie Patterson, Kansas Territory, 1839. "Margaret," Rebecca whispered as she stared at the photograph, her voice hollow with disbelief. "Rose isn't your housekeeper, is she?" Margaret's hands stilled on the medical kit she was preparing, and when she looked up, her face held the weight of 12 years of carefully constructed lies. "No, child. Rose is my sister. My baby sister who was 8 years old when they sold us to different men in different territories." Rose stepped forward, her young face etched with pain that made her look far older than her 20 years. "I've been searching for Mary Rose, for Margaret, ever since I escaped from the man who bought me. It took me 4 years to track her down, and another year to convince her to let me stay without revealing the truth to anyone else." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, adding another layer of deception to an already complex web of lies and half-truths. Rebecca felt the foundation of her trust beginning to crack as she realized that everything Margaret had told her about her past had been filtered through careful omissions and strategic revelations. "Why didn't you tell me?" Rebecca asked, her voice small and hurt. "Why all the pretending?" Margaret sat heavily on the bed, looking older than her 26 years as the weight of her secrets finally surfaced. "Because the truth is more dangerous than you can imagine, Rebecca. Rose and I aren't just survivors of the trafficking network. We're witnesses to murders, to systematic crimes that stretch across 5 territories. If certain people knew we were alive and together, they'd kill us both to keep their secrets safe." Rose nodded grimly. "The man who bought me didn't just disappear one day like I told everyone. I killed him when I was 16 after he tried to sell me to a brothel in Denver. I've been living under false papers ever since, always looking over my shoulder, always ready to run." The confession hit Rebecca like a physical blow. These women who had saved her, who had offered her sanctuary and hope, were themselves living in constant fear of discovery and retribution. The ranch that had seemed like paradise was actually a fortress built on blood and desperation. "There's more," Margaret continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The network that destroyed our families, that murdered your mother and sold all of us. It's bigger than just a few territorial criminals. It reaches into the territorial government, into the Federal Marshal Service, into places you wouldn't expect." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the ranch yard. Margaret was at the window instantly, her face draining of color as she counted the riders. 12 men, she said grimly. "Armed and riding hard. This isn't a social call." Rose began pulling weapons from hidden compartments around the room. Rifles, pistols, boxes of ammunition that revealed the ranch's true nature as an armed compound rather than a peaceful homestead. "How did they find us so quickly?" she asked as she checked the loads in a shotgun. "Someone talked," Margaret replied, her voice hard as stone. "Someone who knew enough to put the pieces together after today's testimony." She turned to Rebecca, her eyes blazing with fierce protectiveness. "Whatever happens in the next few minutes, you stay low and you stay quiet. These men aren't here to arrest us. They're here to silence us permanently." The riders surrounding the ranch house were not federal marshals or territorial officials, but hired killers whose presence confirmed Rebecca's worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy they had stumbled into. Their leader, A scarred man with cold eyes and a voice like gravel called out demands that chilled Rebecca's blood. "Margaret Whitmore, or whoever you really are, you've caused enough trouble. Send out the girl, and maybe the rest of you live to see morning. Keep protecting her, and we burn this place down with all of you inside." Margaret's response came in the form of a rifle shot that shattered the lantern one of the men was holding, plunging half the yard into darkness. "The only way you get this girl is over my dead body," she shouted back, "and I promise you I'll take at least half of you with me." The siege that followed was unlike anything Rebecca could have imagined in her worst nightmares. The ranch house became a battleground, with Margaret and Rose moving from window to window like seasoned soldiers, their shots precise and deadly. The other women who lived at the ranch revealed themselves to be equally skilled with weapons, turning the supposed sanctuary into a fortress that held off attackers who clearly hadn't expected such organized resistance. But Rebecca knew that no matter how brave the defenders were, they were outnumbered and outgunned by men who had nothing to lose and everything to hide. The attackers had already set fire to the barn, and smoke was beginning to drift toward the main house on the evening breeze. "Why are they doing this?" Rebecca cried out during a brief lull in the gunfire. "Why can't they just let us go?" Rose reloaded her rifle with hands that never stopped shaking. "Because we know too much. Because your father's testimony this morning implicated people with enough power to destroy territories if their crimes come to light. Because sometimes the only way to keep a secret is to kill everyone who knows it." Margaret fired 3 quick shots that drove back an attacker trying to reach the front porch, then turned to Rebecca with eyes that held the accumulated pain and wisdom of someone who had seen too much of human cruelty. "Rebecca, there's something else you need to know, something about your mother's death that I haven't told you." Even in the midst of the battle raging around them, Rebecca felt her heart stop. "What about Mama?" "She wasn't just trying to expose the trafficking network," Margaret said, her voice barely audible over the sound of gunfire. "She was my friend. We corresponded for months before she died, sharing information about missing girls and suspicious auctions. She was planning to bring federal investigators to Copper Creek the week she was poisoned." The revelation that her mother and Margaret had known each other, had worked together to fight the same evil that now threatened to destroy them all, hit Rebecca with the force of a physical blow. Everything that had seemed like coincidence, Margaret's presence at the auction, her intervention on Rebecca's behalf, her knowledge of the trafficking network, suddenly revealed itself as part of a larger pattern of justice delayed, but not denied. "Your mother died trying to save girls like you," Margaret continued, as she prepared for what looked like the final assault. "She died trying to give you and your sisters a chance at freedom. If we don't survive tonight, Rebecca, I need you to remember that. I need you to know that everything we did because she would have wanted us to." Outside, the attackers were regrouping for what appeared to be their final assault. The barn was fully engulfed in flames now, and the wind was carrying burning embers toward the main house. Rebecca could hear the men shouting orders, could see the orange glow of fire reflected in their eyes as they prepared to end the siege once and for all. Margaret handed Rebecca a small pistol, her calloused hands gentle despite the violence surrounding them. "If they get past us," she said quietly, "if Rose and I fall, you use this on yourself rather than let them take you alive. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Rebecca stared at the gun in her trembling hands, understanding for the first time that some fates were worse than death, that some freedoms were worth dying for. Around her, the women who had saved her were preparing to make the ultimate sacrifice to protect her, and she realized that whatever happened in the next few minutes would define not just her survival, but her understanding of what it truly meant to be free. The final assault began with the sound of breaking glass and the acrid smell of smoke. and Rebecca closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for her sisters, wherever they were, hoping that somehow they would survive, even if she did not. The thunder of approaching horses that cut through the gunfire was not reinforcements for the attackers, but the arrival of Federal Marshal Jake Coleman with a company of cavalry from Fort Tucson. The sight of uniformed soldiers emerging from the desert darkness sent the hired killers scattering like roaches in lamplight, their leader shouting desperate orders as his carefully planned assault crumbled into chaos. "This is the United States Army!" Coleman's voice boomed across the ranch yard as his men formed a battle line. "Lay down your weapons and surrender, or face the consequences of firing upon federal officers." The siege that had seemed destined to end in tragedy transformed into a rout within minutes. Margaret's careful documentation of the trafficking network over the past 2 years had provided Coleman with enough evidence to justify federal intervention, and Thomas Hayes's testimony that morning had given him the legal authority to act immediately. Rebecca watched in stunned amazement as the men who had come to kill them were herded into custody like cattle, their weapons confiscated and their hands bound with military efficiency. The scarred leader who had demanded her surrender now cowered before Coleman's interrogation, his bravado evaporating in the face of federal justice. But even as relief flooded through her, Rebecca knew that the immediate danger to herself meant nothing if her sisters were still trapped with men who now had every reason to silence them permanently. The exposure of the trafficking network had made Sarah, Emma, Catherine, and Grace into witnesses who could bring down powerful people, witnesses who were far easier to eliminate than to protect. "Marshal Coleman," Margaret said as she stepped onto the porch, her rifle still in her hands and smoke still rising from the burning barn, "my sisters are in immediate danger. The men holding them will kill them rather than let them testify about what they've witnessed." Coleman's weathered face was grim as he surveyed the aftermath of the battle. "Mrs. Whitmore, or should I say Miss Patterson, I've got federal warrants for the arrest of Jacob Miller, Wesley Brooks, Frank Turner, and Henry Cooper. But serving those warrants won't mean much if we're too late to save the girls." Rose appeared beside Margaret, her own weapon ready, and her face set with determination that reminded Rebecca of her sister Catherine's fierce spirit. "Marshal, these men have killed before to protect their secrets. They won't hesitate to do it again, especially now that they know federal investigators are closing in." The rescue operations that followed were coordinated with military precision, but Rebecca's heart hammered with terror as the hours stretched by without word from any of the teams dispatched to save her sisters. Each minute that passed could mean another sister lost forever, another family bond severed by men who treated human lives as disposable commodities. The first news came from Miller's ranch, where Sarah had indeed given birth to a healthy daughter despite the traumatic circumstances. But the baby's arrival had triggered something unexpected in Jacob Miller, a protective instinct that had transformed him from captor to guardian. When Coleman's soldiers arrived, they found Miller standing guard over Sarah and her newborn with his own shotgun, refusing to let anyone near them until he was convinced they were truly federal officers. "I may have bought her at that damned auction," Miller told Coleman as he surrendered his weapon, "but I'll be damned if I let anyone hurt her or her baby now. That girl's been through enough hell for one lifetime." Sarah herself was weak from childbirth, but alive, clutching her daughter with fierce maternal protectiveness as federal medics examined them both. When Rebecca finally saw her eldest sister again, Sarah's first words were not about her own ordeal, but about the welfare of her other sisters. "Have you found them?" Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from labor and fear. "Are Emma and Catherine and Grace safe?" The rescue of Emma from Wesley Brooks's store proved more harrowing. Coleman's men found her locked in the upstairs room, surrounded by the macabre artwork collection that documented Brooks's previous victims. Brooks himself had fled during the night, leaving behind evidence of at least 7 murders spanning 5 years, paintings and sketches that would never be finished, dreams that had been cut short by a madman's obsession with owning beauty. Emma was physically unharmed but emotionally shattered, her artist's soul wounded by the realization of how close she had come to joining the collection of silenced women whose work decorated Brooks's walls. She clung to Rebecca with desperate strength when they were reunited, her normally gentle demeanor replaced by a haunted wariness that spoke of traumas that would take years to heal. "He showed me their drawings," Emma whispered against Rebecca's shoulder. "He made me look at them and told me stories about each girl, about how long they lasted before they stopped being useful to him. He was already planning what he would do with my paintings when I was gone." Catherine's rescue from Frank Turner's saloon became a gun battle that left 2 of Turner's men dead and Turner himself wounded but alive. Federal soldiers found her in the basement storage room, beaten and defiant but unbroken, her green eyes still blazing with the same fierce spirit that had sustained her through 3 days of captivity. "I knew you'd come," Catherine said when she saw Rebecca, her voice steady despite the bruises that covered her face. "I knew Margaret wouldn't let them keep us. I just had to stay alive long enough for you to find me." Turner, bleeding from a shoulder wound as soldiers dragged him away, spat curses at the sisters who had destroyed his profitable business. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled. "There are dozens of us across the territories, hundreds of girls being bought and sold every month. You've saved yourselves, but you can't save them all." The most disturbing rescue involved Grace, found at Henry Cooper's isolated farm in a situation that defied rational explanation. Cooper had dressed her in his deceased wife's burial clothes and had been conducting mock marriage ceremonies in the farmyard cemetery, speaking to both Grace and his wife's grave as if both women were present and willing participants. Federal soldiers arrived to find Cooper holding a loaded pistol to Grace's head while delivering a rambling monologue about eternal marriage and the duties of wives beyond death. Only the intervention of a military chaplain who managed to convince Cooper that his dead wife would not approve of violence prevented a tragedy that would have haunted Rebecca forever. Grace emerged from her ordeal with a strange, otherworldly calm that worried everyone who saw her. She spoke in whispers and seemed to drift through conversations like a ghost, her normally vibrant faith replaced by a hollow acceptance that suggested deeper wounds than anyone fully understood. "He said I was Elizabeth," Grace told Rebecca during their reunion, her voice so soft it was barely audible. "He said Elizabeth had come back to him and that we were going to be married forever and ever. I started to believe him after a while. It seemed easier than remembering who I really was." As dawn broke over the Arizona territory, all 5 Hayes sisters were finally together again at Margaret's ranch, surrounded by federal protection and the smoking ruins of what had been their sanctuary. The barn was a total loss, and the main house bore scars from the night's battle, but they were alive and free in ways that had seemed impossible just days before. Margaret stood with Marshall Coleman on the front porch, watching the sisters reunite with tears and laughter and desperate embraces that spoke of bonds no amount of trauma could truly break. The legal battles were far from over, and the criminal investigations would continue for months, but the immediate danger had passed. "There's still the matter of your own legal status," Coleman said quietly to Margaret. "Mary Rose Patterson disappeared 12 years ago, and Margaret Whitmore's identity was built on forged documents. The federal government will need to decide what to do about that." Margaret's smile was tired but peaceful as she watched Rebecca teaching Sarah's newborn daughter to grip her finger with tiny, perfect hands. "Marshall, I've spent 12 years running from who I was and building who I needed to become. If the price of saving these girls is facing justice for my own crimes, then I'll pay it gladly." But Rebecca, who had learned more about courage and sacrifice in the past week than in all her previous 14 years, stepped forward with a determination that reminded everyone present of her mother's fierce spirit. "No," Rebecca said firmly, her young voice carrying an authority that surprised even herself. "Margaret saved our lives, saved our family, and exposed crimes that would have continued for years without her intervention. If the federal government wants to prosecute someone, they can start with the men who created this network in the first place." As the sun climbed higher into the desert sky, painting the mountains gold and promising a new day free from the shadows of the past, Rebecca realized that their story was far from over. But for the first time since standing on those courthouse steps, she believed it might have a happy ending after all. 1 year after the courthouse steps that had nearly destroyed their family, Rebecca Hayes, now Rebecca Patterson Hayes by legal adoption, stood in the same spot where she had once faced auction as human property. But today, the courthouse square hosted a celebration that would have seemed impossible during those dark June days of 1851. Sarah held her daughter Hope Margaret Miller close to her chest as she exchanged wedding vows with Jacob Miller, the man who had bought her at auction but had chosen to love and protect her instead. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Phillips, who had spent the past year rebuilding his congregation's understanding of Christian duty and human dignity. Jacob's transformation from reluctant purchaser to devoted husband had become a symbol of redemption that gave hope to everyone who witnessed it. "I promise to honor you not as property, but as my equal partner in life," Jacob said, as he placed a simple gold band on Sarah's finger. "I promise that our daughter will grow up knowing she belongs to no one but herself, and that love is always a choice, never an obligation." Emma stood as maid of honor, her artistic talents having found new purpose in documenting the stories of trafficking survivors across the Arizona Territory. Her paintings now hung in the Territorial Capitol building in Phoenix, part of an exhibition that educated lawmakers and citizens about the human cost of treating people as commodities. The trauma of her captivity with Wesley Brooks had left scars, but it had also given her art a power and purpose she had never imagined possible. Catherine served as Sarah's second attendant, though she had to interrupt the ceremony twice to give legal advice to women in the crowd who were facing their own struggles with abusive husbands or exploitative employers. Her studies in territorial law had progressed so rapidly that she was now apprenticing with the Territorial Attorney General's office, preparing to become one of the first female lawyers in Arizona's history. Grace played the church organ for the ceremony, her musical talents having provided her with a path back to the faith that Henry Cooper had nearly destroyed. She had spent months working with a female missionary doctor who specialized in treating the psychological wounds of trafficking survivors, and while she still spoke softly and moved carefully through the world, the light had returned to her eyes. Margaret, who had legally reclaimed her birth name of Mary Rose Patterson while keeping the Whitmore surname that had protected her for so many years, watched the ceremony with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen justice triumph against impossible odds. The federal investigation she had helped initiate had resulted in 43 arrests across 5 territories, effectively dismantling the trafficking network that had operated with impunity for over a decade. Rose Patterson Whitmore, officially recognized as Margaret's sister and co-owner of the ranch that had become a model for victim rehabilitation programs, managed the logistics of the celebration with the same efficiency she brought to running their sanctuary. The ranch now housed 23 women and children, all survivors of various forms of exploitation, all learning to rebuild lives that had been stolen from them. Federal Marshal Jake Coleman, who had been promoted to territorial supervisor following his successful investigation, served as one of Jacob's groomsmen. His presence at the wedding represented more than friendship. It symbolized the federal government's ongoing commitment to protecting vulnerable populations and prosecuting those who preyed upon them. Thomas Hayes sat in the front row of guests, his face etched with the complex emotions of a man who had committed terrible crimes but had found a path to partial redemption through his testimony against the trafficking network. His cooperation with federal investigators had resulted in a suspended sentence, but the true punishment was living with the knowledge of what his cowardice had cost his family. He would never fully forgive himself, but his daughters had chosen to forgive him, understanding that healing sometimes required extending mercy to those who had wounded them most deeply. Judge Samuel Morrison was notably absent from the celebration, having been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for his role in facilitating illegal auctions. His replacement, Judge Amanda Richardson, the first female territorial judge in Arizona, had made reforming the legal system's treatment of women and children her primary mission. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, the female physician who had saved Sarah's life during her difficult labor, had established a medical practice that served the remote areas where trafficking victims often found themselves. Her work had revealed the extent to which the medical profession had been complicit in crimes against women, and she was leading efforts to establish ethical standards that would prevent such abuse in the future. The wedding feast was held at the Patterson-Whitmore Ranch, where tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by women who understood the preciousness of abundance after experiencing hunger and deprivation. Children played in the yard, some the biological offspring of the residents, others adopted foundlings who had been given new families and new chances at happiness. As the sun began to set over the Arizona mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded everyone present of the beauty that could emerge from darkness, Rebecca found herself standing once again with Margaret at the edge of the celebration. "Do you think Mama would be proud?" Rebecca asked, watching Sarah dance with her husband while baby Hope slept peacefully in Emma's arms. Margaret smiled, her weathered hands folded over the letter she had received that morning from the territorial governor, officially pardoning her for any crimes committed during her years as a trafficking victim and recognizing her contributions to justice and public safety. "I think your mother is dancing with us right now," Margaret said softly. "I think she's watching her daughters choose their own paths, build their own families, and create the kind of world she dreamed of but never lived to see." The celebration continued into the evening, with music and laughter that echoed across the desert, but Rebecca felt drawn to walk to the small cemetery where they had buried Wesley Brooks's victims, 7 young women whose names had been recovered from his records and whose artwork had been returned to their families when possible. At the cemetery's entrance stood a monument that Margaret had commissioned, bearing the inscription, "In memory of those whose dreams were silenced, whose voices were stolen, whose stories we promise to remember. May their loss light the path to justice for others." Rebecca placed a small bouquet of desert roses on the monument, thinking of the girls who had not been fortunate enough to have a Margaret Whitmore step forward at their moment of greatest need. The trafficking network had been dismantled, but she knew that similar evils existed in other forms, in other places, preying on the vulnerable and the voiceless. "We can't save them all," Rose said, joining Rebecca at the monument. "But we can save some, and sometimes saving some is enough to change everything." As they walked back toward the ranch house, where the celebration was beginning to wind down and the guests were preparing to return to their own homes and their own lives, Rebecca realized that the story that had begun with 5 sisters standing on courthouse steps had become something larger than any of them had imagined. It had become a story about the power of chosen family, about the courage required to stand against systemic evil, about the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. It had become a story about love that was freely given rather than purchased, about dignity that could never be taken away no matter what legal documents claimed, about the truth that some things, hope, freedom, the bonds between sisters, could never be sold at any price. The Hayes sisters had begun their journey as property to be auctioned, but they had ended it as free women who understood that their greatest strength lay not in their individual survival, but in their determination to ensure that other girls would never face the horrors they had endured. As Rebecca fell asleep that night in the room that had become truly hers, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for second chances, for chosen families, for women like Margaret, who refused to let injustice go unanswered, and for a future where daughters would never again stand on courthouse steps waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. Dear friends, this story reminds us that family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who choose to stand by us when the world seems darkest. In our own lives, we've all known the power of someone who believed in us when we couldn't believe in ourselves, who offered us dignity when others saw only our struggles. Like Margaret and the Hayes sisters, we find our greatest strength not in what we've survived, but in how we choose to help others survive. Whether you're a grandparent watching your family grow, or someone who's built a chosen family from friends who became closer than blood, remember that love freely given is the most powerful force in this world. What moments in your own life reminded you that family is about choice, not just chance? Have you ever been someone's Margaret, the person who stepped forward when others stepped back? Share your stories in the comments below and let's celebrate the families we've built and the love we've chosen to give.